Welcome back to my channel, guys. The topic of this video has been requested many times over the years of having this channel, and I've never tackled it head on for a video because, first off, it's a huge subject. It's like, how do you even get into such a sensitive topic as mental health and how Grindr may or may not be responsible for gay men's mental health? I feel like I'm just a person who uses apps like the rest of you guys watching. And it's like, is that enough credibility even to speak on such a big subject as the responsibility of an app like Grindr on mental health? I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm just one person using these apps. The other thing is, I don't have as much of a cynical view of Grindr as I know many of my subscribers and viewers do, meaning I've always had the mindset that you can't really blame the app or the platform or the company. Ultimately, people are responsible for their own decisions that affect their self-esteem, their confidence, their mental health. And I know that's not a popular opinion because that puts accountability on a person, but that is still what I believe. I think Grindr is just a variable. If it wasn't Grindr, it would be Tinder. If it wasn't Tinder, it would be another app. If it wasn't apps, pre-apps, there were still vehicles for gay men to meet that weren't exactly kosher, right? The gay bar is a subject that has come up on this channel before, and to me that's kind of a similar thing where it's a very polarizing subject. Some people are at gay bars every weekend. It's not a big deal, it's fun, it's lighthearted, and for some people, I think Grindr is analogous to the gay bar in that it's this place where you see a lot of the sadness of gay men, and you see addiction, and you see rejection as well, and you see some of the worst qualities associated with gay men. But ultimately, I believe that if you're sensitive to rejection on an app like Grindr, then you're going to be sensitive to rejection through these other vehicles as well. That being said, all of this being said, the other day I was thinking about this topic because I was on Grindr and I messaged a guy, and I messaged him, it wasn't anything controversial that I messaged him or anything that could warrant this kind of response, but he blocked me immediately. And typically for people who don't use Grindr, when somebody blocks you on Grindr immediately after you message them, unless you do something, again, controversial, where they're like disgusted or repulsed or freaked out, it's a common practice actually to block people on Grindr when you're not interested in them, because it frees up space on the grid. The way Grindr works, for those of you who have never used it, it's GPS based, and it shows you the closest 100 profiles around you. So if you block people left and right, you're actually freeing up profiles in your vicinity. So on a logical level, it actually makes sense potentially to block people, but on an emotional level, right? It's kind of like a callous thing to do, especially if somebody has just messaged you. You're basically saying, no, I'm not interested. I don't want to see your face again. And so I was kind of taken aback, but because sadly, I know this is a thing on Grindr and it's not the first time it's happened, it didn't really affect me. It was just a little bit jarring, like, whoa, that was quick. But I thought to myself, going back to this subject of Grindr and mental health and how does it impact mental health, I thought this would have bothered me more years ago. And it did bother me years ago. In the same way that using even more traditional dating apps like OkCupid was the first dating app I ever used like a decade ago. And I remember being so jolted by people's callousness, or I remember I would send like really thoughtful, long intro messages to show that I had read, this is me in like my early 20s, to show that I had read the person's profile, and then I just wouldn't hear back. But on an app like OkCupid, and I know Grindr does this, you can see when they were last online, which is so like devastating when you realize they definitely read your message, they're just not into you. But my point is, in the beginning of using these apps and also just being much younger and being new to dating, I think your mental health is much more fragile. The fear of rejection or the reality of rejection has a much bigger impact because you're just more innocent. And I was definitely more wholesome and more, I don't know what the word is, polite, maybe, more thoughtful. I was much more thoughtful and conscientious when I first used any of these apps. But over time, right, you kind of get used to this flow of, oh, most people are not actually going to be as thoughtful back, so why even waste your time? The mindset I have now, and this goes beyond apps, this is even just like friendships in the real world, I have learned to be more reciprocal as a person, where if somebody shows me their kindness and their thoughtfulness, then I'm more willing to invest in that connection. But off the bat, especially with a dating app, I'm more likely to kind of go in with a wall sort of up. And I think that's a defense mechanism from years of using these apps. So thinking about this subject of mental health, it sort of dawned on me like, wow, it's interesting that I'm now at a point where rejection on apps, or a guy that seems really cool not responding to me, it used to really bother me. And now I'm just so used to that being a possibility that it doesn't affect me. So what I'm trying to say is essentially, I do still think it's about the person, not about the app. Because you can't control who decides to sign up for an app. You can't control other people. What you can control is your decisions that affect your happiness and your mental health. I definitely think these kinds of apps, especially Grindr, that's so hookup and transactional oriented in nature, I think some people just are not meant to be using these apps because it provokes their Achilles heel too much. But I don't think that's on Grindr's responsibility. I do think there's certain things that these apps could do, I guess, to prevent an addictive nature to apps. For example, the thing I mentioned about showing when somebody's online, I think that's kind of a dangerous thing, frankly. And also, I don't think it's fully accurate. I've noticed that it doesn't seem to be fully accurate because I've had guys message me like, where are you? Why aren't you messaging? And I'm like, I was in the shower. Like, what? Why this urgency? I think apps use tactics like this to keep people kind of hooked. But that does create in somebody's mind, I think, an excitement that you would find, let's say, in gambling, right? It triggers some kind of dopamine effect of like, oh my God, this person's online, hope they respond. But that part is actually, I think, not good for people's psyche because you're more likely to feel ignored or rejected even if you're not, even if that person's actually not online or they're in the middle of doing something. So do apps have a responsibility to be more conscientious of their users? Of course. The reality is, just like all the other industries in the world that rely on human temptation, whether it's tobacco, drinking, gambling at casinos, at a certain point, I think humans have to be accountable for their own behavior and not repeating the cycles of the hamster wheel, right? That they know they have sensitivities to. The idea of, could these apps be built differently, or could they just be banned altogether to avoid the decline of gay men's mental health, to me is sort of like saying, should bars be more thoughtful of addicts, of alcoholics, or should bars be completely closed down as an industry because of the potential consequence of addiction? There's no doubt these apps and the experiences on these apps, the rejection, the cruelty sometimes of gay men on these apps, that can trigger somebody's, again, Achilles heel with mental health. But again, I do believe that if it wasn't that medium, it would be another one. Thinking about my own personal experience of having this epiphany recently, realizing, oh wow, I don't really get affected, I don't get as sensitive or in my head about rejection on these apps like I used to. On the surface, that seems like a great thing. to have grown out of that and to not care as much. But I also do fear how much of that is becoming numb or jaded to rejection and just people's shitty behavior. And that numbness or that jadedness, I find, is kind of pervasive among gay men on and off apps. And just people in general, I do think that is definitely an effect of dating apps, that generally people are sort of drained and exhausted from the process of dating. And you always hear people complaining about dating apps, but then they go back to it, me included. But just like gambling, and I've compared it to gambling in other videos before, it's like you're chasing that 1% high of actually meeting somebody interesting, and where, again, you get the dopamine hit of like, oh, I'm excited talking to this person. But 99% of the time, you really are wasting time. The difference for me now is it doesn't bother me as much as it used to. The idea of wasting that time, I don't invest as much emotionally as I used to. But again, I'm not sure if that's a great thing, because if it's coming from a place of being sort of jaded by it or numb to it, that's also saying quite a bit about yourself and society, that it seems to be a pervasive thing. For those of you who were adults before the apps ever existed, I am curious what you think. I'm curious what everybody thinks, but I'm particularly curious for those who were adults, adult gay men before apps existed. Do you think that it has drastically affected society in a negative way as it pertains to things like mental health? Or do you feel that before it was apps, it was something else? It was, you were seeing the same sort of effect at the gay bar or wherever else. I'm tempted to think with the epidemic of HIV/AIDS that there has always been a connection between gay men chasing each other and not the best mental health and not the best self-esteem. But what do I know? I'm just a millennial trying to make sense of our world. Please let me know in the comments your thoughts on this subject. And again, it's very easy to say, yes, these apps are horrible for mental health, but that's it's such a big blanket statement that if you feel that way, I would like to know concretely, like why you think these apps have so much power versus humans having power over their own mental health. I hope that makes sense. Let me know in the comments what you think.